spectrum of common issues, and we're just covering some very common areas that we all deal with, we all face at various points in our lives. And so things like anxiety, anger, worry. This morning we want to look at the topic of depression. I don't know if we're going to get through it this morning. We may do 2 weeks here, but we'll see. And of course, like any of these subjects, we can't be exhaustive on this subject because there's so much. I think I don't know how many things I've read in the last kind of 2 weeks getting ready for this. It's not the most fun reading about depression for 2 weeks, but actually, as you do, from biblical counseling perspective, you get a lot of hope because you're hearing a lot of how to handle it. But that's what I've been thinking about for a little while now, and reading different books and whatnot. So being reminded of old things and just different resources. So I've got a lot of resources. If you want some, maybe I'll mention some at the end, either this time or if we have to go a second time later. I want to start, though, with Psalm 42. Psalm 42. Maybe if there's any text that you should think about when you think about this subject, this is probably a great go-to text. Psalm 42. Actually, Psalm 42 and 43 are likely one psalm, and based on the structure and repetition. But in Psalm 42, this is a great text here for being downcast. The superscript says, "To the choirmaster, MASKIL of the sons of KORAH, as a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, 'Where is your God?' These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day, Yahweh commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go on mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, 'Where is your God?' Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Vindicate me, O God, and defend my cause against an ungodly people. From the deceitful and unjust man, deliver me. For you are the God in whom I take refuge. Why have you rejected me? Why do I go about mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? Send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy, and I will praise you with the lyre. O God, my God. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God." Isn't that good? You can see how these connect together. What is an indication that these psalms go together? Yeah, so that repetition, what did you say over here? The same verses? Yeah, same repetition. Yeah, same thing. So he says it in verse 5. He says it in verse 11 of 42. And then he says it there at the end of 43:5. So you see this threefold repetition. What might that indicate to you just about life and about this kind of soul struggle? Sure, it's important it happens. Yeah, if we're thinking about this long ago, right? Yeah. Common to man, as 1 Corinthians 10:13 would say. Exactly, yeah. It's not like you just deal with it once and you say to your soul once, hope in God, and you're like, okay, I never have to battle this again. That's not the guarantee. In fact, it's actually setting us up for the continual need to remind our hearts of truth over and over and over again. Here's what Martin Lloyd-Jones, the doctor, the double doctor, he'd say he's the soul doctor, and he was a medical doctor who had a promising career even with the royal family, and but he went into ministry as a preacher at Westminster Chapel in London, and he wrote a book called Spiritual Depression, series of sermons kind of compiled, and here's what he said about this psalm, and it's a great classic quote, very helpful as he's applying this to our lives. He says this: "Have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? Take those thoughts that come to you the moment you wake up in the morning. You have not originated them, but they are talking to you. They bring back the problems of yesterday, etc. Somebody is talking. Who is talking to you? Yourself is talking to you. Now, this man's treatment in Psalm 42 was this. Instead of allowing this self to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? He asks. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, Self, listen for a moment. I will speak to you. He's really saying, hey, there's this self-talk that goes on in our minds, and it can just compound and snowball into despair. And so he's saying you need to talk to yourself. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means speak truth to yourself. Continue to press it. And that's exactly the observation he's drawing from the text, that over and over again, the psalmist just keeps on saying the same truth, actually, but so his heart believes it, continues to remind himself of these things. So very, very good. I actually have it written above this psalm in my Bible. Stop listening to yourself and start talking to yourself. So this is a good start for us. Here's another psalm. Psalm 130, verses 1 and 2 says this: Out of the depths I cry to you, O Yahweh. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. Really, depression is the result of living in a sin-cursed world. There are lots of heartaches. There's a lot of sadness that goes along with this world. There are also numerous well-known and obviously unknown Christians throughout the ages who have battled with depression. We just mentioned that this is a common to man struggle. The psalmist is talking about this kind of despair. But think of others like Martin Luther, struggling this way. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher in London in the 1800s, struggled greatly in this way, maybe for multiple reasons. He had an incredibly difficult circumstance that took place early on in his ministry while he was preaching, and a massive crowd, overpacked, and some young men yelled out fire in the midst of the congregation. And there were so many people, it was hard to even kind of sense all that was happening. But people started to try and escape or get out of the building, and they trampled a number of people who died. And it just weighed so heavy upon Spurgeon for so long. And he says he couldn't even preach on that text because of the text that he was preaching on that service, because it just so associated with that event. It clouded it. So another one is William Cooper, who John Newton had a big influence in coming alongside and encouraging him in his severe depression. Cooper even tried to take his life a number of times, but had great encouragement from fellow believers. Cooper has written, though, some incredible hymns that we have in our hymn book, and we benefit greatly from those. His name looks like Cowper, so if you're like looking up his story or whatever, I think Piper has in one of his biographies, he has like a ton of biographies, the Swans Are Not Silent series. He has one on William Cooper. Usually there's like 3 to a biography, 3 figures, and he clusters them around a theme. He has one on Cooper, but it's Cowper, but it sounds like Cooper, William Cooper. So, God moves in a mysterious way. I believe that's one of his, and so that's a great hymn. And actually, I would say we're getting ahead of ourselves, but as you begin to say, well, how do we deal with depression? I think one thing that's helpful is giving people and yourself great hymns of the faith that are going to bolster and build your faith. You know, maybe you feel like you can't even sing, but pull it up on YouTube or on your Spotify or whatever, and listen to some great hymns. And that's one of them. Here's a guy who has struggled, and he's writing his thoughts, and it's such a great hymn. So you can almost think, even though Cooper struggled, he knew what he needed to believe because he expressed it in incredible hymns. And so he's fighting to believe those things. So we see it as a challenge for believers, even through the ages. In fact, let me just scoop to the end here for a resource, because the title of it, Robert Somerville, is a biblical counseling professor at the Master's University, and he wrote a book called If I'm a Christian, Why Am I Depressed? Do you remember having Thanksgiving at the Businesses with him? Yeah, him and his wife? They were there, yeah, so, and the Gregorys. So, yeah, so we actually had Thanksgiving when we were, just Ashley and I, before Maggie and the other kids, and so we got to spend some time with them. But he went through a pretty significant bout of depression, and so he wrote about that as well some years ago. Anyway, that's a helpful resource. Here's another proverb. We're just kind of getting started here. Proverbs 18, verse 14. Proverbs 18:14 says, "A man's spirit will endure sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear?" What a proverb. But don't you love that the scriptures speak to our problems in such a realistic way, right? I mean, that's so true to life. Like, I'll be sick physically, but this is almost like too much to bear. I wouldn't lead with this if I was talking to someone who is depressed, but Martin Lloyd-Jones says this. He says, "A depressed Christian is a contradiction in terms and is a very poor recommendation for the gospel." Now, what he doesn't mean is that Christians can't struggle with depression, but he's just saying, hey, this is a poor testimony to be like, don't you want to be a Christian just like me? But obviously, I wouldn't lead with that and just beat down on someone. But helping someone with depression is not just listening. It's not just, being there. That's a huge part. But we need to see what's at the root here. What are they believing? What are they thinking to offer real substantial help? Now, let me make some other clarifications. Feeling down or sad is not depression. I think we need to make some distinctions. I think the term for us, maybe it's just for me at least, it's just become kind of a catch-all. We don't use it super specifically maybe, or maybe some people want to avoid it because they do import a lot into it. But really what we're going to see is that depression is when we begin to neglect responsibilities because of our feelings or our mood. That's really, I think, what distinguishes it. There's Charles Hodges, a medical doctor, and also later became a biblical counselor. He's written a book that's very helpful called Good Mood, Bad Mood. And he said that prior to the 1980s, there was, actually, let me find his quote here. He talks about a difference that took place. Here we go. He said, after 1980, about 90%, in his opinion, of what is diagnosed as depression by the culture would have before been classified as normal sadness due to some loss. In other words, there's a lot of loss that we face. There's a lot of reasons to be sad in our world. And there's even a book someone's entitled Medicating Normal. And the idea is that there's a lot of just normal sadness that we in some ways should expect because of loss in our lives. And he's saying, Hodges says this is a quote of his, he says, depression is about how we respond to the losses we suffer in life. And so he says if 90% are really in the past would have been classified as just a normal sadness due to some loss, then he says of the 10% remaining, around 5 to 7% may have some medical condition associated. And then he says that leaves about 3% who cannot speak to the reason for their sadness. So just interesting to see some of his observations here about even how the culture has shifted. Also, just interestingly enough, in 2020, there was a massive uptick of people being diagnosed or medicated for anxiety and depression. And you think of the way our culture views it, they talk about mental illness, and I think we've already talked about this a little bit. In some ways, I mean, we've got to clarify our terms, but like biblically, like you can't have a mental illness, right? The mind is immaterial. We believe in a body, an inner man, outer man, and so it's just a conflation of terms. Most of our world, our culture, believes in just materialism. They don't believe in an immaterial soul. So if your body dies, your mind continues to function, right? Paul says, absent from the body, present with the Lord. He goes to be with the Lord. He's there. His mind is functioning, but his brain has stopped working, right? So there is a difference there. Of course, we understand, though, that there's somewhat of a mystery as to how one relates to the other in impacts. They do have an impact on one another. So we have to be humble there. It's not saying we don't know how all those things work. But often what's happening is there is something that is being viewed as an illness and used in illness terms that is something that's about inner man issues and interpretation of circumstances. And I think that's a huge factor in thinking about these things. So what we want to do is begin by looking at what is a definition of depression. A definition. I kind of went off there for a second. The interesting observation that some have made was, if this is purely just a physical, medical issue, which sometimes it is, I will say that. I mean, so what I mean is there are certain medical conditions that will bring on symptoms that are that lead to depression. So, or some medications will even say that it may cause depression. And so, obviously, that's not what we're talking about here. There are known things, physical problems that you can go and have a test for and see, oh yeah, you have this, and it's known to produce that. So that's not what we're talking about there. That's why I think it's always good if there is depression to say, well, have you had a medical exam? Like, I'm not a medical doctor. Biblical counselors aren't medical doctors. I mean, some of them are, but I'm a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. And so I always say, like, hey, you need a medical exam. You need to see, like, are there anything contributing to this that may not be, or that may be related physically? And if they should do that, but then there's another side of this that if that's not the case, then how do we think about this? How do we think about this? And what I'm trying to say is if there was this massive uptick, which we could probably just say happened because of circumstances, right? The circumstances surrounding 2020, then wouldn't that incline us to think that it's maybe more about perception and about our circumstances and our thinking about our circumstances more than it was that some kind of all of a sudden all these people just started getting diagnosed with this. So I would venture to say it seems more plausible that it had to do with the people's despair over their circumstances and how they were thinking about them, leading them to seek those measures. So let's think about a definition of depression. A definition. Here's this definition kind of in different forms I found in different places. Robert Smith, John Street, and others have kind of tweaked this definition over time. So I don't know who's this original with, but here's one form of it. A quote, and this is seeking a biblical definition of depression, not necessarily, like a definition from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, Volume 5, from the APA. That's not what we're looking at here. We could look at some of those cluster symptoms, but that's really what they're doing. They're just looking at clusters of symptoms that they're observing, and they're just giving a label to them. So here is a definition here, trying to pull together biblical themes. So, quote, depression is a persistent, debilitating mood, feeling, or sense of hopelessness that becomes a person's reasons for not handling the most important issues of life. Let me read that again. Depression is a persistent, debilitating mood, feeling, or sense of hopelessness that becomes a person's reason for not handling the most important issues of life. Actually goes on a little bit, and it says, this, just to qualify what we're talking about, this is a spiritual depression of the soul that has not come from any organic chemical disorder of the body or from the side effects of medication or illegal drugs. So what he's trying to clarify here, I think this is in Street's definition, is he's saying, what we're not talking about is if we can identify some organic disorder of the body, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're addressing here. If we can note that there is some illegal drug use that may have the result of this, then that's not what we're talking about here. So we're talking about this spiritual depression of the soul. J. Adams, in one of his works, puts it like this, quote, a depression is a cyclical process in which the initial problem is mishandled in such a way that it is enlarged in downward spirals that eventually plunge one into despair. The downward cycle enslaves one in hopelessness and guilt, thus bringing a slowing down or cessation of activity called depression. That's helpful. The cycle, the spiral, right? It just gets tighter and tighter. And that's what he's trying to describe there, and just increases and compounds hopelessness and guilt. And it ultimately leads to almost like a seizing up of the engine where you cease activity. I think it's, who goes on here? Robert Smith, he says, he looks at two aspects of this, feelings and actions. He says, quote, bad feelings are the result of the failure to handle normal life responsibilities in a biblical way. He says, but not all bad feelings are the result of this failure. There are also occasions when they may arise for no known cause other than the curse of sin or human life. No human being will feel good at all the time, no matter how spiritual he or she is. Those feelings do not mean a person is depressed or is necessarily handling life unbiblically. So if we begin to feel sorrow or sadness over a circumstance, that's not depression. That's actually probably a normal response to certain things in life that we live and experience in a fallen world. What can happen, though, is if we have something that happens and maybe threatens to rob our peace, and the way we interpret it begins to compound such that we start and eventually neglecting responsibilities that God has given. That's really the thing I think to take away from this, is that it's the neglect of responsibilities that comes. It's not the initial sorrow and sadness that's the issue here, or that is sin. It's not sin to be sad, right? In fact, there's a lot of times when godly saints are sad because of circumstances. In fact, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4 that we grieve, we're sad, and yet not without hope, right? Because we have cause for hope in the midst of that. So there's a normal grief, a part of life, but Paul is reminding them of truth so that they don't devolve into leaving responsibilities and becoming depressed in that sense. So depression is not discouragement or being down. That's different. Street says when you are discouraged, you are down, but when you're depressed, you are down and out. When you're discouraged, you're down, but when you're depressed, you're down and out. Smith says something similar. He says you must be careful to distinguish between depression and discouragement. What separates the two is that in depression, the person ceases handling life or some area of life and becomes immobile. In the case of discouragement, a person keeps going. The key factor in depression is immobility. Ed Welch, in his book, A Depression, A Stubborn Darkness, this is a helpful book. He suggests two contributing factors to depression. He says events outside of us that we cannot control, people, events, illness, and other physical problems, and then internal beliefs, spiritual allegiances and interpretations we can change. And he says the interaction of these two are what causes depression. Joel James, in his work, he lists many other things that are kind of associated with depression, often, not all these at the same time, but just, observing different cases. He says failure, disappointment and sadness, anger, fear, loneliness, passiveness or a lack of enthusiasm, a sense of impotence to change unpleasant circumstances, a sense of meaninglessness, an inward focus that makes one's world seem very small, fatigue, neglect of life responsibilities, unconfessed sin, a wrong view of God. He's just listing out a number of things to help, counselors think about, all right, let me think of some factors here. Wayne Mack, in his book entitled Out of the Blues, he's trying to help people think about these things. He writes this: depression is caused by a person's response to an event in their life, not the event itself. So I think that's pretty helpful in that he's trying to help us think about stuff happens to us often that's outside of our control, that may be cause for sadness. But how are we going to respond to that? How are we going to respond to that? I was listening to, Dr. Streets had a massive influence in my life as far as just Christian life and thinking. Had him in seminary. He was when you get certified as a ACBC counselor, you have to do a number of hours of counseling that's supervised by a fellow who's been counseling forever. Dr. Street was my fellow, and so it's a lot of my thinking on so many issues related to counseling have been influenced by him. I would recommend to you really anything he's written. But he made this point. I was kind of watching something I hadn't seen of his recently, and he made this point, and I thought it was just so pastoral. He said often when he goes to the hospital and visits someone, he'll ask them 3 questions, and he says, number 1, he'll say, okay, can God heal you? And so they'll say, yes, he can. Okay, he says, has God healed you? And they say, well, no. Of course they could say yes, but he says, if they say no, then he says, 3rd question, so what would God have you to think and do in light of that? Well, how does God want you to think and act in light of that? So we know God can heal you, but we know for some reason he has not. So how does God want you to respond to your circumstance now? In other words, how does God want you to please him and respond and think about this circumstance? And I just thought, wow, that is so pastoral and helpful, and it just brings a conversation to bear. And he listed a number of examples of, one person who says, well, I guess one thing is the Lord would want me to respond to this in a way that would have an impact on my unbelieving son so that he would see just my hope in the Lord and all that. So, okay, maybe that's one way the Lord wants me to respond. So, just very, very helpful there. Where are we at here? I'm just kind of going all over the place. I do have notes, but I've been thinking about this so much, it's all kind of coming out. Here we go. But our response, that's right, Wayne Mack, not the event itself, but our response to the event in our life. How are we going to respond? This is the definition of depression. Next, I want us to consider the diagnosis of depression. And I put it this way because in our world's thinking, you get diagnosed as depressed. This is probably one of the most diagnosed psychiatric diagnoses, and it's an increasing one in our days. One writer said this: the incidence rate of depression for those born after 1950 as much as 20 times higher than the incident rate for those born before 1910. Interesting. Here's an important observation. There's a difference between a medical diagnosis and a psychological diagnosis. A medical diagnosis is looking for an identifiable pathology, right? They might take a sample, they might take blood, they may do various things to test and see what might be measured objectively. What often happens with the psychological diagnosis is often based upon the descriptions and labels that are given in the DSM-5, and that's where the edition it's in now, and they are really clusters of symptoms, and so they're just listening to the patient describe feelings and thoughts that they have, and from their subjective experience, and then making a determination and labeling something based upon that. It's often what is happening. Interestingly enough, I was listening to Greg Gifford in his Transform podcast, and he was talking about how he's writing a book on some things related to this, and he said he set up an appointment. I want to get to some of the details right here. He set up an appointment with a psychologist, I guess, to talk about things in his life, and it gave him. He didn't even get to meet with someone. He had a telephone kind of call, and they asked him a number of questions, and he answered honestly. And he said they labeled me as depressed, and they, without even seeing me, without like any other follow-up, they recommended that I get on psychotropic drugs. And it's like, you haven't even met me, you didn't do any tests besides just asking me my thoughts. And he wasn't trying to come off as depressed and say certain things. He was describing himself, and he's like, they said I was depressed. He's a biblical counselor. I mean, biblical counselors can get depressed too. But it was just interesting. Now, obviously, that is one example. That's not everyone. I'm not trying to say that at all. But there has become such an association in our culture with depression now that we've seen so many commercials, you might think about like that, where that you just come to believe like, okay, yeah, this is a medical issue only, and so it's not for the realm of Christians or pastors to handle these issues. Now, I'll say once again, yeah, of course, there are certain medical conditions or even medications that can bring on depressed symptoms, and that's not what we're talking about. I think it's always prudent to say, rule out those things. In other words, rule out anything physical that might be happening. But having done that, how should we then think about your circumstances and your response to those circumstances? It's interesting, of course you think, well, what about like a chemical imbalance? That's been like a theory for quite some time, and it is just that, it's a theory. They haven't been able to prove that, and so I think there should just be some humility that, that's one guess that they have as to how that works. I think here's probably a good balance. We should be careful not to be on their side to say, there's nothing really spiritual going on here about thinking. That would be a misstep, because we know that even if there's a physical problem, we can still address people's circumstance with the Bible, right? But on the other hand, I think it's good to say, well, there's a lot about the human body we don't know. We're ignorant of how certain things work. And so we ought to be humble in that way and recognize that we go as far as we can with medicine, but we can't completely know what's going on. Ed Welch has a helpful book looking at this called Blame It on the Brain, ? And he's just kind of thinking about these various things. Charles Hodges in his book, Good Mood, Bad Mood, deals a lot with that as well. But it's not only Christian counselors that are thinking about these issues. There have been a lot of people in the medical community and psychological community who have really questioned, and many have abandoned the chemical imbalance theory. They're looking for another area of the brain or maybe a different way to think about this. I think they're still probably in that mentality of not thinking about the soul, but they're kind of moving away from that idea because they haven't been able to find it to be conclusive in that way. So the point being, we're not medical doctors, but so we want to encourage people to get help from their physician as a first step. But after that, we want to be sure that we can address and bring biblical perspectives to these things. We don't know the pathology that underlies it definitively, but it's not, we might say it like this, it's not a sickness to be sad, right? And so we want to be able to offer hope to people. In some ways, it is hopeless if you just think, I just have this condition and I'll just have it. But rather, the Bible would speak to us as being able to respond to the circumstances of life, even if certain things don't change. I think medicine, by the way, is a Christian liberty issue. It's a Christian liberty issue that someone has to think about and think through. So I'm not saying one way or the other. And Christian, you'll hear this, and I think it's wise, biblical counselors, I'm not a doctor. Don't get off your medication. Sometimes people hear this and they think, I need to stop. No, don't do that. I'm not a doctor. I can't do that. I didn't put you on this. The person who put you on this needs to talk about that. That is between you and your physician. That's not at all what I'm saying. And so it's a Christian liberty issue. But I think it's important to note that that's not the root issue, right? That's not the core issue, right? If you sat on attack, this is Charles Hodge's illustration. He says, if you sat on attack, you would feel pain. And if you took some medicine to make the pain go away, you didn't deal with the issue, the root underlying issue. You made yourself feel better, but you didn't deal with the main issue. Sometimes things get so severe that people can't sleep and they're having issues, and that can actually lead to a lot of challenges in your body. So some people just need to be able to sleep for a while and get back to a normalcy so that they can begin to work on these issues. So there's a lot of factors that play into this, but a few people listed one study here that was done some time back, and that was listed in an article in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, and it was a double-blind study of the effectiveness of certain antidepressants, and really they had three groups of people, and they had some people on an antidepressant, they had some people on St. John's wort, which is like an herbal supplement, and then they had some on a placebo, a pill with inert ingredients. And what they saw from it was that they saw kind of like an even spread of the effectiveness of the three, which is fascinating. And some have pointed out that one of the indications of that is that it had a lot to do with the hope that the patient believed this would bring them. So if they believed that this was going to help them, what they were taking, then they had increased benefit to that. And so that's JAMA. That's not any biblical counselor or anything. They're noticing this and having to make adjustments to their theories as well. So we don't know everything there is to know, but it should give us some pause here, at least, to say, okay, this is not just a medical issue. It could be the result of a medical condition. Once again, we're not talking about that. But what we're talking about biblically defined as depression, the Bible is sufficient to address these things. And we also understand that the way we think can have effect upon our bodies, right? And a significant effect. Listen to Proverbs 14, verse 30. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. That's so interesting. It's having to do with your thinking, with your heart, and the effect that it can have on your body. I've heard the illustration this way. It's like if you were to, just imagine I went out and I had an orange tree, and or actually I do have a lemon tree, so let's think about a lemon, okay? So after like 2 years, I think, almost, and so it's getting better, I think, each year. But let's just say, give it a few more years, and we've got a really great lemon, and I pull off a lemon, and I peel that thing, and the juices are just kind of going, they're coming out, and it's going into the air, and I open it up, and I put it up to my nose, and I smell it. Now, you might be salivating right now as a result of some of that description. And what happened? Did you have an orange in your hand? Is there the smell of an orange around you? No, but you could probably start to think about those things, and it begins to maybe make you salivate when it's described to you. What's happening? Well, your thinking is having some kind of physiological impact upon your body. And we understand that there's this kind of mysterious interplay between inner man, outer man. And so we understand that you can even just watch a commercial, the juicy steak and there's butter and just like and you're like, oh, and you're salivating, you're wanting to eat it, and you're getting hungry, right? And hunger pangs. So you're seeing something, you're interpreting something that's not actually there, and you are having a response. So we understand that. And so I think that's a helpful thing to recognize as we think about how we respond to circumstances. Jim Neuheiser, another biblical counselor, says, calling depression a disease is depressing because it offers no hope. It offers no hope. There's various reasons that we could experience depression. It could come from guilt. That's not always the case, I'm going to say that. But think about Peter after he betrays Jesus. I mean, he's just so burdened and just beat down. Many people are overwhelmed with guilt that's leading to depression. And let me say this, we should expect that. Right? Think about, you think, like, what is, and here's another interesting thing. Some in the non-Christian community have observed, like, why do we see an uptick? And one of the things they list is decreasing religious involvement. And so it's like, interesting. Okay, so obviously we don't think any religion is good, we believe in the true God, but it's interesting that I think there's a correlation between if you live without any reference to God and you just go your own way, you're your own authority, you should expect to feel guilt. You should expect to not being right with your God, to be down and depressed. So that could be a factor, unconfessed sin. Sometimes people are overwhelmed, though, with their circumstances, worry, and this leads to depressed feelings. Anger can be related. Having judgments about how things should be, expectations, and them not going that way, and becoming angry. There can be a correlation there between those two. Grief and loss and sadness is not depression, but we can move into a depressed state if we don't, well, as Paul would say, grieve with hope in those circumstances. A good place to look about sorrow and sadness is described in Psalm 102. This is a great passage to look at various reasons for it. Life's brevity. He talks about his body aching, spiritual problems, lack of nutrition, lack of sleep, others cruelly treating him, wrong thoughts about God. And yet then he begins to remind himself kind of at the hinge of God, and he reminds himself of his sovereignty and other things. So God hears his prayer then, and he begins to help him. So here's the definition and diagnosis. Got 3 minutes. The next thing I want to do is begin to just look at some descriptions of depression. We're just going to look at one, and it's in the life of an unbeliever here, but it actually gives us principles regardless of who you are. In Genesis 4, here you have Cain, and notice what the text says. We'll pick it up in verse 3. Genesis 4, verse 3. This is in the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. In other words, his countenance fell. Notice the connection here, like we already mentioned, between anger and depression. He's visibly downcast. Yahweh said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen?" And then here's the counsel God gives to him. If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desires for you, but you must rule over it. Interesting that Cain has these feelings, and he's becoming ruled by these feelings, and God is telling him, you need to do what's right. You need to do what's right. In other words, actions over feelings. That's part of the counsel that he gives him. You can't live by feelings. You need to live by what God has said. And so he's saying, why does this happen? And notice how, in many ways, God is gracious here. He's drawing him out. He's asking him questions. What is going on? What's your heart here? What is the cause of your anger? What is the cause of your downcast heart? And then he gives him counsel of how he should act. You know what you need to do, Cain. You know what you need to do. You need to do what is right. What have I revealed? What have I told you? That's what you need to do. And what will happen if you do that, if you listen to the word of God, Well, will you not be accepted? Will you not be accepted? It kind of gets smoothed out here in the ESV, but even in mine, in the footnote there, it says, will there not be a lifting up of your face? In other words, won't there be a change if you do what's right? So think about this related to the responsibility aspect, that it leads to a failing to do what God has called us to do. That's certainly the case with Cain here. And he's saying, hey, if you do what is right, there will be a change. There will be change. You'll see a change. So this is one of the descriptions. We can look at others. Jonah, Job, Elijah, Paul, various David in the Psalms. We've got a lot more to look at here. And then we'll look at next time as well, dealing with this and just a number of principles to restore hope. I mean, that's a huge thing, is restoring hope to those and just gently dealing with them, and yet also seeking to uncover what is at the root of this. What are beliefs and desires that are functioning potentially as ruling idols that need to be identified as well in the midst of this. So we'll look more at that next time. So let me pray. Father, we are grateful that your word is sufficient. It is sufficient for the problems that we face. While our world would seek various explanations of things that for so many centuries your people have found hope in your word for. They may have called it different titles, melancholia, and different terms, but when we look at the descriptions, Lord, we are often talking about the same kinds of troubles in life. And yet, Lord, so many in the past have not been without hope until the modern era. They have found hope in your word. They've found hope in the scriptures and the people of God and in your character. So may it be true for us as well, that we in our troubles and sorrows of life would find our hope in you, that we would fulfill that which you have called us to do, living by faith, not by our feelings alone, and that you would then bring an uplift in our countenance, and that you would allow us to be instruments in your hands to help others, to point them to hope in you. Lord, may we be gracious and patient with others, and yet also willing to ask hard questions to help them in the long run. So we ask that you would guide us as we study even next week, Lord willing, on this subject as well. In Jesus' name, amen.